Two insightful conferences where he addressed the ways and byways of Canadian radio and TV regarding the the dynamics of religion among us. Dr. Higgins, president-elect of St. Jerome University, has edited, authored, and co-authored many books, and I would like to draw your attention to the last two, namely the Jesuit Mystique, which has been very well received even by the Jesuits themselves, and this year Heretic Blood, which is a spiritual geography of Thomas Merton. Tonight, Dr. Higgins will discuss with us the place of religion in our Canadian newsprints, and he entitled his presentation, A Fractured Word, Print. Dr. Higgins, we're all yours.
Thank you. I have absolutely no idea what Jacques said, but I'm sure it was good. Speaking of the fractured word, it's taking me years to try to figure out what he's talking about, and when I did, it seemed to me ignorance was bliss, but I can't revert back to that happy state. Now I know what he's talking about. Anyway, tonight it is my pleasure to bring this to an end. We have been looking, I think, rather intensely at the role of religion in the media. And as I made clear last night, it seems like a decade ago, everything is so concentrated, but last night I talked specifically about the foundations, and I made it clear that it was very difficult in thinking about this series and putting my ideas together to think about the Canadian media in isolation from its American and British equivalents. And so once again, as I did with radio and as I did with television, I will also be referring to the British and to the American equivalents, and by the end of the evening to the Australian. Because I think it's very important and instructive to get a sense of how we deal with some of these issues by looking at them in the context of the international media, specifically, of course, in this case, English. Let me read something to you, first of all, to start it off, which might give you a sense of the pecking order of religion in the news media in this country, in the print. This is a column taken from one of Canada's better newspapers, and it is generally one of Canada's better newspapers, and it's a list in a clearly hierarchical fashion of the role and function and importance of the editors and the others who constitute the hierarchical crew of the newspaper. So we start, not insignificantly, and certainly not surprisingly, with the publisher. Then we move on to the editor. Then we move on to the chief news editor. Then the executive news editor. Then the news editor. Then the international editor. Then the city editor. Then the city inquiries editor. Business editor. Sports editor, arts editor, editor of photography, books editor, style editor. You will notice that none of these are in alphabetical order. Homes editor, food editor, wheels editor, travel editor, and at the bottom, religion editor. I think that speaks volumes. Far more than anything else that I say. The fact that the religion editor is not out of alphabetical sequence. He, in this particular instance it is a he, is at the bottom of the list, two below the wheels editor. Right? So what does that say about the value that we attach to religion as reported in the print media? Well, I think it speaks an awful lot. And I want to understand and explore tonight with you ways of trying to figure out what precisely that does mean. Why in the structure would the religion editor be two below the wheels editor? Why, for instance, is it that in many of Canada's newspapers, both local, provincial, and even those that would deem themselves national, it is rare to have an appointed religion editor. And when you do have them, they are now basically only two in the country. They've been retitled as faith and ethics reporters. They've been stripped of their editorial rank. They are now basically reporters. And in some instances, as is the case with the Toronto Star, they fall under the general responsibility or control of the lifestyle editor for the weekend edition. So what's happened? Paul Johnson, as you may know, is a British historian and a columnist. And in a particularly interesting, he's always provocative, but in a particularly interesting column in his aptly named column, and another thing, Johnson says the following, speaking about the French. He's always speaking about the French. He's obsessed with the French, as most conservative classical English writers are. But like most conservative classical English writers, he loves the French. But notice where he goes with this column and how he concludes. Johnson: the French can be selfish and even petty, especially when their pride is aroused. They are also, and more usually, capable of high-minded magnanimity and intense loyalty. A Frenchman does not offer close friendship easily, but once given, it is never withdrawn, however foul the weather. A French woman who loves you will defend you to death. You will see that Paul Johnson is inclined to stereotypes. The French are sometimes quixotically forgiving and heap coals of fire on your head. I have experienced this twice in recent years. When I disparaged a book by their greatest living historian, Emmanuel de Roy-Ladurie, he responded by giving a generous review to a book of mine. And when, in this column, I rebuked the French severely for their shortcomings 3 or 4 years ago, their reaction was to republish the article uncut and elegantly translated in their most distinguished publication, La Revue des Deux Mondes. For that gracious return of good for evil, I gave thanks by saying a contrite prayer to Saint Jeanne d'Arc. And that reminds me, the French produce the most wounding mockers of religion, but they also produce some of the noblest saints. Scratch a French atheist, I always say, and you will soon find beneath the cynical carapace someone who longs to love God and God's work. End of quote. Now this is mildly amusing in its own way, utterly illustrative of Johnson's frame of mind and his continental thinking, very much reflective of his combative instinct, and a kind of splendidly executed bit of Johnsonian prose. But it also reveals other things. I suggest to you that in a way he wouldn't have written that column in any other publication. He most certainly would not have written such a column in a Canadian publication. What you see him writing here about English-French relations and his relationship with the French and the French intelligentsia, he most clearly and in an emboldened way speaks about in terms of religion. In fact, Johnson is almost an old-fashioned apologist in the tradition of Hilaire Belloc. He enjoys fighting his adversaries. He takes on social Darwinists and biologists of particularly intransigent points of view. He argues in public about the validity of the religious impulse. He makes hay when he wants to in both political and social circles. He vaunts and delights, indeed, indulges his conservative instincts with relish and panache. The Spectator allows it. The Spectator encourages it. His boss, Conrad Black, rejoices in it. Johnson takes religion seriously. So does the Spectator. So do thousands of its readers. And it's fun. It's fun to read in its pages that religion can still be an engaging topic, even in a country where 10%, fewer than 10%, go to church at any given time. I'm talking specifically about the Christian composition of England. It's a little different with some of the other traditions. The fact still remains, as I had alluded to the other day, in spite of the fact that the British may be, quotation marks, unreligious, or the most secularized of all the English-speaking countries, and I think that that's not particularly arguable, nonetheless, their interest in religion, and religion as a determinative of the culture and political makings of society, goes unassailed or remains indisputable. The British take their religion very seriously. They take it more seriously than their fish and chips. Thank God for that. There's an interesting article by Mary Kenny. Mary Kenny is a British playwright, a British novelist. Sorry, not a novelist. She's a British columnist and essayist, and she writes now for one of the tabloids. She used to write for one of the broadsheets, and has been for a very long time a voice for a conservative point of view in the British press. Not in the same way as some English writers who, like Alice Thomas Ellis or Pierce Paul Reid, who tend to take a very strongly and unbendingly conservative point of view, harkening back to the mid-19th century. But Mary Kenny takes, I think, an enlightened point of view. She's always vigorously debating the orthodoxies of the day. And in an interesting column called Down Among the Tabloids, she speaks specifically about the fact that the tabloids themselves now, the Daily Mirror, the Sun, the Daily Mail in England, take religion as seriously as the broadsheets. Okay, so you've got the Independent, the Guardian, the Times of London, the Daily Telegraph, the Sunday Telegraph, the Observer. They all have full-time religion editors, columnists, reporters, correspondents indeed. They usually refer to them as religious affairs correspondents. But invariably in their editorial section, in their weekend editions, it is not uncommon to find substantial coverage of religious issues, debates over religious issues and religious figures. Now the tabloids are doing it just as enthusiastically. In fact, Mary Kenny's colleague, a woman who takes a sharply more liberal point of view, I shouldn't say sharply, but a more liberal point of view, is Melanie McDonough, who's currently on sabbatical in Oxford, but will be returning to her position, again working with one of the tabloids. But Kenny, in a specifically pugilistic moment, responds to the critics who've observed her transfer from the broadsheets to the tabloids with a comment drawn from that perhaps most celebrated of fighting apologists, Malcolm Muggeridge. She says, this is Kenny, "I think church people should read the tabloids sometimes, because this is where the raw issues are aired first, and you might argue, where certain religious values most need to be upheld." Malcolm Muggeridge famously said that being a Christian in the media was a bit like being a vicar playing the piano in a brothel. He might occasionally get to play Abide With Me, but he was still in the bordello. At least let's hope someone gets to hear. Well, Kenny will work and has already worked assiduously to make sure that indeed somebody will hear in the bordello. Janet Watts, also a British columnist, has observed in a recent series of articles about the shift in newspaper ownership and direction in the British press, comments on the fact that the move to cover certain particular events, which once would have been seen as verboten amongst the broadsheets, is now common with them as it is with the tabloids. So covering certain nefarious issues, gossip around the monarchy, scandals under the sheets or indeed on top of the sheets, concern about all kinds of issues that originally or initially the other newspapers like the Thunderer et al. Would have considered beneath them, is no longer the case. Journalists now struggle to have their voice heard. And in that struggle to be heard at no matter what level, whether it's a newspaper owned by Rupert Murdoch, Sir Rupert Murdoch, or owned by Conrad Black, the point still remains that there's a common pool, there's a struggle for a hearing. In that battle, and there is a huge battle going on in the British press for readership, In that battle, religion plays a very significant role. Vastly disproportionate, once again, to official denominational membership, patterns of worship both within traditional Christianity and other mainstream traditions outside of Christianity. The interest in religion in England is palpable at both the popular and intellectual level. The correspondence isn't so easy to observe in the Canadian context, however. If you look at, and I've been careful in doing this over many years, I serve often as the Canadian correspondent for the Tablet of London, so I get a chance to read this rather carefully and regularly. You will see in the reportage of such established correspondents as Paul Vallely, Clifford Longley, Kenny, as I mentioned, and Melanie McDonough, but also Ruth Gledhill of the Times, and informed and intelligent sensibility at work. All these religion correspondents don't just simply cover the so-called religion beat, they are informed about it. They understand the discourse and the jargon. They know, in a sense, the issues. In other words, they're informed correspondents. It's just, as we were mentioning, or as I mentioned the other day, it's what you would expect. When the Globe and Mail assigns someone to the ROB, so you're going to be working on the report on business, and you're going to be covering, as Tom Walcombe used to do, when he worked for the Globe and Mail before he moved over to the city desk of the Toronto Star, when he opened the Tokyo bureau of the Globe and Mail, one of the reasons for his appointment rested in the fact that he had a doctorate in economics from the University of Toronto. He would be able to observe the Japanese economic system and understand it. That has been the case with most ROB appointments. When they assign editors or correspondents or reporters to a particular issue, they look at their level of demonstrated competence, their qualifications, their track record, particularly if they're veteran reporters or journalists that they're bringing in from outside. On the religion beat, none of this applies. Just simply doesn't apply. I've known many of the religion reporters personally at the Globe over the years. None of them even had an interest in religion. I remember a long conversation with Jacques Goulet, who actually developed an interest in religion as a consequence of being appointed religion reporter. He resented it. He considered it a demotion because originally he handled the books page of the Globe and Mail, and there was an internal political fracas. They appointed Catherine Ashenberg, and he got booted down to the religion page. Well, not the page, there isn't a page. He got to cover the religion beat. He resented it enormously. As it happened, over the years, he developed a keen interest in the workings of the religious sensibility, both institutionally, but more importantly in terms of art and culture. He no sooner got to the point that he felt comfortable with the portfolio, they moved him out and gave him the computer desk. Now he does the computer file in the Globe and Mail. Right? But previous reporters who held the position never underwent any such conversion. They resented the appointment at the beginning, and they resented it as much when it was given to somebody else. I think perhaps the most famous case, as far as I was concerned, because I have occasion many times to work with these reporters and correspondents, was John Alamang. John has a sharp intelligence. He's very interested in a number of things. He writes a wine column. He's very au courant with issues in the continent. He's an Oxford grad. He has a sharp interest in cultural values. He just doesn't happen to be interested in religion. And they gave him the religion beat. He had enormously great difficulty distinguishing between ecclesiastical politics, theology, religious studies, the critical study of religion, and a number of it. They just didn't mean anything. It was all in, well, it wasn't Greek, it was a muddle to him. His previous his predecessor, this was before the Globe decided just simply virtually to dispense with it. They now have a part-time person who covers the religion beat by the name of Joan Breckenridge, and she just appears occasionally. But Alamang's the previous holder of his august chair was Staniszewicz. I've been teaching at the school that Staniszewicz had graduated from when he went on to actually become a very fine reporter at the then Peking, subsequently Beijing bureau of the Globe. He replaced John Fraser when Fraser had gone back to open the bureau. And I can remember on one particular occasion covering an event in Toronto when he phoned me up and he was just stunned. And he said he had just come from a press conference with a well-known prelate, and it was very clear that this prelate had lied to him, and he found this devastating. He said, I don't know what I'm going to do. I don't know whether I'll be able to continue my career in journalism. I said, you just returned from the Peking Bureau, and you're stunned by the fact that somebody in authority lied to you. What are you saying? You know? I mean, are you expected to, do you leave your skeptical and critical intelligence at the door when you were accepted the religion beat, and you expected suddenly that everything that you were going to have to do was going to be either promotional or accepted on faith? Eventually, he was assigned another desk. I can't remember quite what it is right now, but he's kind of flourished in it. But the whole history of the Globe's appointment to religion has been, when not haphazard, consistently disastrous. The point is simple. They never took it seriously. They still do not, even under Thorsell, especially under William Thorsell, take religion seriously. We now have the only national newspaper in the English-speaking world that does not, so self-claimed, that does not have a religion editor or reporter. Can you imagine the New York Times without one? Peter Steinfels is their senior religion editor. There's one for the Washington Post. I met the one at the Los Angeles Times. They're well-informed, I think, very conscious of the change of the religious and cultural environment in North America, and indeed sensitive to this change. The Globe and Mail has no one. By the way, the list I just gave you there when I was going through the pecking order wouldn't even appear in the Globe and Mail, because there would be no listing at all for it. I think this is lamentable. And I'll get later to the explanation, very poorly advanced by the Globe and Mail, to justify its reason for not making an appointment of a religion editor, although they've never been entirely public about why they have not done so. There have been several issues over the year, pressure on the publishers and others to make changes. The reasons advanced have always seemed to me at best specious. Anyway, this is all by way of saying this is in stark contrast with the British tradition of reportage and the seriousness with which the print media, we discussed earlier, this also seems to be correspondently true of the other media, takes religion. For instance, in a fairly recent article, Andrew M. Brown, writing in one of the London newspapers, spent a great deal of time arguing cogently, reasonably, without prejudice, and I think in an entirely objective way, why it is that the possibility of Tony Blair, the British Prime Minister's conversion to Roman Catholicism, would be at best problematic. Okay? This becomes news. People read about it. They're concerned about it. They observe the Prime Minister's actions. They take interest in the fact that he talks about the Christian socialism that shaped him from Iona when he was under John Smith, John Smith's death, the fact that Blair himself had experienced a conversion when he was at Cambridge. He took his Anglican faith seriously. He has for a number of years, because he's married to one of the foremost barristers in England who happens to be a devout Catholic. He raises his children as Catholics. They go to a private school, the Oratory, in London, okay, which has caused a great stir because he's actually the Prime Minister and head of the Labour Party. All these things are a matter for fodder. It's a matter for political debate. It's a matter for informed interest and discussion. Now, it may be, in the large scheme of things, trivial, but it is not seen as so marginal that it remains uncovered. In fact, it's taken far more seriously, it seems to me, than the latest sexual peccadillo of a junior minister. I think that's balanced, or at least somewhat balanced. In the USA, we have a slightly different configuration for the British press. But nonetheless, if you examine over the course of a given year, which I did by way of preparation for this series of lectures, how religion is covered in the magazines as well as in the newspapers, it is stunningly positive. Major articles in the Atlantic Monthly and the New Yorker, as well as the New York Times, under both Dion and Steinfels. Just to give you a few examples, Harper's Weekly as well, or Harper's Monthly rather, all provide on an occasional basis largely informed, sustained, invariably substantive, not infrequently controversial, sometimes rather overly flattering portraits of religious figures and ideas. But it's taken seriously. It is seen as something that matters to the public. It is worth at least as much attention as a profile of some minor sports figure. Now, I'm not being Pollyannish about this. In the larger scheme of things, it's still second run by comparison to celebrity profiles, the kinds of information that generally feeds a good deal of the media and sustains their popularity, and a lot of it is run for profit, unquestionably. We can't be naive about this. But nonetheless, if you look at the Atlantic Monthly in the course of a year, or again and look at the New Yorker, which is published, as you know, by and large weekly, you will find frequent articles or profiles or reviews around, quotation marks, ostensibly religious subjects and ideas that are taken seriously, not furtively, not frivolously, not off the cuff. Now, how does this compare with Canada? Not well, I think. And there are reasons perhaps we can try to figure out, we can surmise, we can speculate as to why this is the case, but it is undoubtedly the case. In Canada, the best current newspapers for religious coverage, for religion coverage, are in fact the papers owned by Conrad Black, including those that are part of the Southern chain. The part of the Southern chain that he did not sell to the Sun in order to purchase the Financial Post. For instance, the Kitchener-Waterloo Record under Pauline Finch-Durkin, the Hamilton Spectator and the Ottawa Citizen all have and retain, as does indeed the Vancouver Sun with Douglas Todd, reporters or religion editors. Kirk LaPointe, who is going to be the new editor of the yet unnamed, but we understand to be titled The National Post, which will be appearing in Toronto later this month, Kirk LaPointe observes the following. He says that Conrad Black's national newspaper will put God back on the front page. And he considers this to be one of the reasons why there have been improved fortunes for the Hamilton Spectator, the newspaper of which until recently he was editor-in-chief. Now, this can be scary too. All right? I mean, when a press baron invokes God, you have to wonder what this means. And it's not necessarily a welcome sign. I think we need to be particularly skeptical about this. At the same time, Conrad Black is indisputably a man who likes ideas. Even his sharpest critics have to concede that Black is a formidable foe. He loves language, there's no question in that. He enjoys intimidating, indeed, and not infrequently bullying his adversaries. But there's also no doubt he is enormously well read. I remember on one occasion when we were doing research on the biography of Emmett Cardinal Carter, I had occasion to spend some time with Conrad Black in his then Toronto offices. And I likened at one point Emmett Carter to Bishop Talleyrand, the celebrated political bishop of the Napoleonic era. I then was subjected to a 30-minute lecture by Black on how Carter wasn't at all like Talleyrand, and how they couldn't possibly make such an analogy. And although a personal friend of Carter's, actually Talleyrand came out better in the struggle. Black takes ideas seriously. Whether he takes spirituality seriously, what role religion plays in his personal life, these are private matters, surely. But in the area of ideas, in the realm of ideas, Black takes religion seriously. Look at the Daily Telegraph, the Sunday Telegraph, the Spectator, the Jerusalem Post, the Chicago Sun-Tribune, and the Canadian papers like the Ottawa Citizen, which he's attempted to reconfigure and in the process increased by a significant volume wordage, plus the amount of time, attention, and competence attached on religion reportage. This is welcome. Even if it expands the Conrad Black empire, a prospect of which I'm not too keen about, it does mean something, however, in terms of the quality of that of which is being reported. The Toronto Star, in contrast, is a privately owned publication, the Atkinson-Honderick family. It's the paper I work for, so I should be perhaps a little cautious about what I say. I think if you look at the Toronto Star, you can see in capsule the kind of crisis that's affected religious coverage in the country over the years in the print medium. The Toronto Star at one point had, with Tom Harper, a very fine writer, now very much a popular writer, more given to writing his own books than covering the religion beat. He maintains a column in the Sunday paper, and he remains one of the most popular writers on religious topics across the country, and a deservedly interesting writer and reader, by the way. a writer and speaker. Tom Harper was at one time senior religion editor of the Toronto Star, and he would have, not quite a platoon, but he would have various connections and kind of junior writers that would work on the Saturday religion page, which was a substantial presence in the Toronto Star, which is still, even now, Canada's largest English-speaking newspaper, largest circulation. It's also largest in weight. If you ever bought the Star, it's a bit like carrying the New York Sunday Times. You need a wheelbarrow to move it around the house. But I can assure you this precious, only one page of it deals with religion. When Tom Harper left to go freelance, his position was replaced by the then former editor of the Windsor Star, a man by the name of Mike McAteer. McAteer worked as religion editor for the Toronto Star for many years, and a good reporter, solid, but not with the kind of searching intelligence and creativity that Harper had. But he was dogged, and he was meticulous, and he was faithful. Harper had the advantage of having been educated at Rhodes. He was an Anglican priest. He taught at Wycliffe College in Toronto for many years. And his theological background, his biblical background, gave him an advantage in the sense that McAteer didn't have. But when McAteer left, and he didn't leave, he wasn't pushed out, but he was encouraged to take early retirement. When Michael left, he wasn't replaced at all. Canada's largest English-speaking circulation newspaper now has no religion editor. When Michael left, what they did originally was they put it under the general rubric of the life editor. Okay? And the life editor has responsibility for all kinds of features and articles and diet columns and Aunt Mary items and all kinds of things. So, I mean, religion is just one part of that large portfolio. They then appointed, and do have right now, a faith and ethics reporter in Leslie Scrivener. Scrivener is a promising writer. She takes her job, I think, quite seriously. She's undertaken to find out more about religion by taking post-degree courses in religion to understand better what she's about. Covering the multi-faith environment of Toronto really demands that now. And I have a lot of respect for the enthusiasm and intelligence that she's bringing to her job. But nonetheless, as faith and ethics reporter, she has virtually no presence in the Saturday edition on the religion page, because ironically, being faith and ethics reporter means that she covers the daily beat during the course of the week. The religion page then remains largely peopled by regular columnists or special to the paper, or unhappily lifted from the wire services. That's the once very powerful religion section of the Toronto Star, which had the capacity and indeed, in fact, the reality of a larger readership and a larger audience than any Christian church in the Toronto area, has now been reduced to a bare shadow of its former self. Interesting, too, it's not all sad news, of course, and does reflect something of the demographic and social change of the Toronto scene, that at the same time, when I was when I was appointed a columnist for the Toronto Star in 1986, there were 4 columnists, there were 4 of us. Rabbi Jordan Perlson, who still writes the column, and an Anglican priest, a United Church minister, and myself. Okay. Now there's me, there's the Rabbi Jordan, there is a woman writer representing a kind of broad spectrum of Christian feminist thought. There is a Hindu writer, there is a Buddhist writer, and there is a Muslim writer. And so we've actually expanded it to about 7 or 8 columns now, 7 or 8 different columnists, to cover the changing religious mosaic of the GTA, or the Greater Toronto Area. Now, I think that that's right. I think that that's absolutely right. It means a reduction proportionately in the presence of the Christian columnists, which was 75% of the religion page as early, or as recent as 1986, to the fact now that we are just a percentage of the larger number of columns being written for an increasingly large non-Christian presence in the Greater Toronto Area. And that's a change for the good, I think. At the same time that that's happening, and it is happening largely for political reasons, there is a significant diminution of the presence of religion as a subject for sustained critical coverage by the Star itself. Now, whether this is Honderich has, like his Globe and Mail corresponding number, decided that in a sense religion only sells when it's at the heart of a scandalous issue, for instance, the Mount Cashel crisis, or the latest expose, usually sexual, but not necessarily so. Sometimes it can be mixed with financial, embranglement, where clerics of any particular tradition are involved in some kind of scandal. Then it becomes news. Or it's yet another variation or twist on the ongoing constitutionality of separate schools in Ontario, and that debate, which never seems to come to termination. Or it involves some other particular issue brought to the fore because Michelle Landsberg decides it's time to light fire under it in her column. But by and large, religious issues, if a major speaker comes to the town, unless it's seen as potentially controversial, the likelihood is it would not be covered at all. Now, what does this all mean? By singling out the Toronto Star as I have done, and I have done so again for reasons that I think are self-evident, it's what I know best. It's the newspaper that I've been working with. I've been able to survey the larger scene, if you like, or canvass the larger scene through reading some of the other publications and meeting various reporters and editors. It's the Star, like the CBC that I work for as a freelancer. I can see the changes that have occurred, and some of them have been for the good, but many of them, sadly, have not been so. It is a puzzle, as Grenville observed in his report for Angus Reid, which I referred to last night, that at the same time that national interest or public interest in spirituality gives no indication of waning. In fact, by looking at the Maclean's magazine issues, examining the most recent Southern polls and everything else, we have every indication that interest in religion is on an increase. At the same time that we observe statistically there is a decline in church membership, at least as far as weekly patterns of worship go, the press does not correspondingly shift its own priorities. Whereas in the British press, religious issues can make it to the front page because they are seen as issues of national consequence, social, political, and intellectual. In Canada, religious issues are still seen as narrowly religious, either for niche marketing or to cover a particular constituency amongst their readers, but not seen as a matter of national public interest. And I think that that is monstrously wrong. I think it's a huge error. And I think the consequences of it are clear when it comes to the debate of religious issues in the public forum. We often find people unfamiliar with the discourse, unfamiliar with the categories, increasingly inclined to isolate or peripheralize religious issues, and, as a corollary, make religious convictions and religious ideas a matter of the private realm rather than the public realm. The declining coverage of religion as a serious subject confirms that. It is a private issue rather than a public one. Now, many of these things have come to a head, and the scenario is not nearly as gloomy or as sepulchral as I might be implying here. Well, not implying, clearly stating. At the Carleton Conference on Faith in the Media that was held at the School of Journalism in Ottawa just this last June, a number of issues came to the fore in a way that they have never done before. Although there had been a media and values conference at St. Michael's College, and there had been a conference funded by the Lutherans at Waterloo Lutheran Seminary in order also to look at the role of religion and media in the country, it was the Carleton Conference that finally broke through. Now, as I indicated in that discussion, that sad, melancholy, if not bizarre discussion that I had on the Ralph Ben-Mergy live program about what constitutes spirituality, if you put that at one end of the spectrum, at the other end of the spectrum you can see a searching effort on the part of various publishers and editors to try to understand or to rationalize why we've gone in the directions we have. Let me give you some indications of what some of these things in fact were. In an article, actually, published in the Vancouver Sun by Douglas Todd, a frequent winner, by the way, of the Templeton Award, Todd makes the following observation. He says, by the end of the conference in Carlton, journalists, particularly top editors such as William Thorsell of the Globe, Kirk LaPointe of Southern's proposed national paper, that is the National Post, that is, we think the National Post, Robert Lewis of Maclean's, and Hannah Gartner of CBC TV's magazine, seemed impressed at the intensity, depth, power, and richness of the religious impulse in Canada. Seemed impressed. He seemed surprised by it. Many religious participants, meanwhile, said they were leaving the conference with a new understanding of the essentially skeptical nature of secular journalism. They began to realize that serious coverage of religion did not mean writing only promotional copy, which is true. One of the problems that exists, particularly in terms of the churches, but also in terms of the temple and the synagogue and other places of worship, in relation to the press, is that very often people expect the press, or they expect, or their spokespersons expect, the press to simply serve as agents for publicity or for promotion. Okay, that you phone up and you say, oh, we're doing this, would you like to cover this? And they may or they may not. If they cover it negatively, then they say, wow, the press is against us. Well, this is an unfair charge. If you're prepared to work with the media, then you have to be prepared to be vulnerable. You have to be prepared to say it's a matter of give and take. You have to understand the native skepticism that should accompany reporters covering the religion beat as they report on an event. That, however, seems to me still to be beside the point. And it was brought home particularly pointedly by a column by the editor, one of the editors of the Toronto Star, Haroon Siddiqui, who, talking about the same conference, says the following, and I'm going to read this. It's not very long, it's short, but it encapsulates part of the dilemma I'm trying to capture here. In its own crude way, argues Siddiqui, the moral majority forced the issue in the U.S. by challenging the secular humanist bias of Hollywood and the media, and by entering politics and hijacking the Republican Party platform. American journalists shot back that most of what's written about religion is in fact quite deferential. Feel-good coverage of religious holidays or papal tours, and that there's not enough public examination of the impact of fundamentalists on politics, or indeed of the moral and ideological problems posed by religions in modern multi-faith societies. A parallel and more thoughtful discussion was initiated by academic Stephen Carter from Harvard in his now famous book, and I quote, Culture of Disbelief, How America Trivializes Religious Devotion. It is a book that even now is President Bill Clinton's favorite reading. Prince Charles said while speaking about the sense of the sacred, and I quote, a majority of us are terrified to admit its existence for fear of ridicule and abuse, end of quote. A harsher critique came from the American author Peter Marin in Freedom and Its Discontents, Reflections of 4 Decades of American Moral Experience, when he says, something has gone radically wrong with secularism. The problem has more than its share of irony, for secularism in the end has converted itself into a kind of religion. Our hallowed tradition of skepticism and tolerance has grown into its near opposite, and now partakes of precisely the same arrogance, the same irrationality and passion for certainty, the same pretense to unquestioned virtue against which its powers were once arrayed. End of quote. It is a healthy debate, argues Haroon Siddiqui, overdue in Canada, and most especially in the Greater Toronto Area, home to all the world's great faiths. Good point, and a sound point. But at the same time, you will see, if not disguised or hidden, certainly implicit, a series of prejudices which are clearly subject to dispute. It's a point that will come home in a column reference here by the Guelph Mercury writer Robert White in his Matter of Faith column, in which he says the following, and then I'll explain further what I mean. White argues that, and I quote, some of the elder statesmen journalists, such as Peter Deborah, formerly Dean of the School of Journalism at the University of Western Ontario, and William Thorsell, who is the editor-in-chief of the Globe and Mail, tried to argue the gap between rationalism, intelligent and rational thinking intellectuals, and fundamentalism, people of faith, prevented adequate coverage of faith issues. The Ottawa Citizen editor, Neil Reynolds, and former Hamilton Spectator editor, Kirk LaPointe, prove the exception to this rule, since both of them have increased faith coverage, empowering their faith reporters, Bob Harvey of The Citizen and Casey Corstagny of the Hamilton Spectator, to look at every aspect of life from a faith perspective. Now, what I quote in there from White, and what the point I want to get back to in talking about Haroun Siddiqui, is simply this. The operating assumption that William Thorsell and Peter Deborah has is fundamentally fallacious. The notion that somehow religion constitutes irrationality, which is the simpler version of the equation, and that therefore the skeptical and secular journalist will be forced to suspend his critical judgment if he is really to cover religion seriously, is bonkers. It makes no sense at all. Surely religion doesn't consist simply of a series of irrational impulses. Such an argument is so outrageously uninformed, one has to wonder what is running through either Thorsell's head or Deborah's. How is it possible to assume or to reduce religion to nothing much more than simply a series of irrational impulses, as if somehow religion, religious subjects, the religious sensibility, religious leadership, and a plethora of religious problems aren't subject to rational scrutiny? The underlying assumption, though, behind Thorsell and Deborah's argument that increased religious coverage in the media is unnecessary because the the training of journalists in the secular media to be constantly scrutinizing and engaged in a skeptical attack on the certainties that religion proffers is really the stuff of caricature. Would you make the same case about political science or the political parties? Or indeed, should I say, that most sacred and unassailable of orthodoxies, economics? And yet somehow or other, Deborah well, in one sense too, that's a little too easy. It's a little too simplistic. If you look at their work, you'll see that they're fairly independent-minded writers in their own way. Surely their thinking, or their ideologies, if you like, conform rather naturally with that of their owner, the owner of the publications they work for. And I suppose in some sense that shouldn't be surprising either. But they don't leave their intelligence at their doorstep. Religion deserves an intelligent and searching representation, presentation in terms of the print medium as much as it does in terms of the other media. It will continue to be lacking such a service if editors of such things as Canada's national newspaper somehow think that the coverage of religion will eventually just simply open up a series of irrational debates, or better yet, it's never going to be entirely satisfactory because it doesn't open itself up to any kind of rational scrutiny. We're not going to get anywhere beyond a narrow Victorian conception of what religion is. This is a view that's in part argued against, I think rather vigorously and persuasively, by the editor of the Winnipeg Free Press, who takes a somewhat more sanguine view, however, of religion coverage in the nation than I do, because he argues that indeed religion can be debated and is debated in the editorial pages, the opinion columns, and indeed letters to the editor. The Winnipeg Free Press is full of them, he says, and the Winnipeg Free Press encourages debate about religion as an important determinative in our society. But it's not quite the same case that one could make in terms of making sure that correspondents and writers, quite independent of guest speakers, always avoiding that perennial this side, that side debate that gets us nowhere, nonetheless allows the paper to take religion seriously in the public forum. Just by way of conclusion now, and some summary comments, because we're getting near the end. When I was in Australia this summer doing some work, as I mentioned this morning, with Thomas Keneally, the author of Schindler's List, and Morris L. West, working on a new book in which they're going to figure, we talked about the press. And I made a point when I was in Sydney with the Sydney Morning Herald, Morning Herald, and in Melbourne with the Australian, which is then that major newspaper there, of trying to observe during the course of the week or 2 weeks that I was there, the religion coverage. I must say that, again, I found it really quite impressive. On one occasion, there was this is the Australian edition of Thursday, April the 23rd. They had a full debate, and I mean a genuine debate, between Tony Abbott, a parliamentary secretary in the federal government, and James Murray, who is in fact the paper's religious affairs writer, talking about the role of clerics in the interference of the churches in the political agenda. It was partly a variation on the liberation theology argument and contextual theology and these kinds of things, but it was nonetheless seen as a matter of serious public debate. It was interesting, when it appeared, I was there for several days afterwards, to see the letters of the editor rolling in, taking issue with this debate. But the debate itself was serious. They didn't bring in just a guest writer to say, oh, well, here's a little thing to show that we take religion seriously. It was taken seriously enough by having articles preceding it, then a debate proper, and then by having letters to the editor coming afterwards. Religion mattered in Australia enough to be considered worthy of serious discussion in the paper. This was also true in the articles by Chris McGillian, who is the regular religious affairs correspondent of the Sydney Morning Herald, who covers on almost a daily basis, like Peter Steinfels in the New York Times or Clifford Longley with the Daily Telegraph, on an almost daily basis, some particular religious issue, not narrowly Christian, not even Christian, but a religious issue of importance for the nation. One can long for the day when such is going to be the case here. And there may be historical and cultural reasons why this is so. I've been trying to work it out, why it is so, why in Canada we seem so unlike the others. We've moved the religion beat and religious coverage increasingly to the periphery. We've engaged in what is sometimes just a game of nomenclature. In some instances, we've either trivialized religion, or we've so isolated it because we fear its potential for divisiveness, or we've marginalized it because we consider it a minority interest. At the same time, the magazines, the polls tell us with almost relentless consistency that public interest in religion and religious issues, and specifically spirituality, is on an increase. The newspaper reportage, the correspondence, the reporters, and the daily coverage seems to significantly diminish. Where do we go from here? Well, in the course of these 3 lectures, and they've been of varying length, I appreciate those of you who sat through this morning's hour and a half, as we've looked at, or as I've tried to look at, the role of the radio, the role now of print, the role of the screen and the cinema, as we struggle with trying to put a face on the religious issue in the Canadian context, it seems to me abundantly clear that wherever the sources of power and influence may be, whether it's the corporate realm or whether it's the political, nonetheless the point has to be communicated somewhat insistently that religion matters enough, ever enough, to be the subject of continued dialogue. That religion reporters, where there are some, should be as schooled in their discipline as economics and business reporters are in theirs. When you end up with a situation, as I may have indicated already to you, when you go off to cover a particular religious event and you're sitting wedged between a labor editor and a food editor who are there because they've never been in that city before and they ask their editor to be sent, you'll wonder what seriousness is attached at all to the coverage. So it matters. It matters significantly. Religion in this country, it goes without saying, it's banal, it's a cliche, and it's self-evident, we all know this, is of consequence. It's a shaper, it's a predicator, it is a determinative of our life and our meaning. I would argue significantly more so than many other things, like sports, wheels, travel. It deserves a place not at the bottom of the list, but a little further up. Maybe not the top of the hierarchy, but the middle would be satisfactory. Thank you. Now, we have a little time for questions or comments. I'd be happy to answer them. Yes, Jacques?
You said you would conclude by telling us why it's like that in Canada. I'm still waiting for the why it's like that.
Oh, sure. Well, that's next year's Seton lecture series. I come back and give you the answer. I can only surmise why I think this is the case. Clearly we've had a shift certainly the national press, in moving religion into the private sphere. We don't talk about the religious ideas or the religious instincts or the religious impulse in the public venue, certainly in relation to our leaders, the way the Americans do and the way the British do. I use the example of Tony Blair. One could just as easily use the example of Bill Clinton, although it might be a little dicey to do so under the circumstances. But the point still remains that the religious convictions of our members of Parliament just do not seem to be a matter that the reporters or their editors or indeed the public want to know anything about. And so we don't tell them. I don't think that that's in fact true. And let me give you an example of why I don't think it's true that the public doesn't want to know. I do think it's true that the editors and reporters have decided that it is not a matter of public interest. When Robert Bourassa died, there was a wonderful article in Le Devoir talking about Bourassa's deep spirituality, his prayer, his daily meditation, the struggle he had making moral decisions in cabinet and concerning the province and the province's future. It was subsequently translated into English and appeared in only one Canadian publication, Catholic New Times in Toronto, a small, liberal, left-to-center Catholic publication with a circulation of 11,000 and a readership of 22,500. Okay? Not much. Now, why would this be considered of no interest? You know? Charles de Gaulle's spirituality was considered quite a bit of interest. Le Monde regularly reported on it, as did other French publications. It helped to shape his sensibility. Bill Clinton or Al Gore or any number of religious figures or political figures in the United States, their religion is not a matter to keep hidden behind some kind of screen, but is as much a subject for discussion, examination, coverage, perhaps cynical, highly skeptical, perhaps a little irreverent, certainly not deferential in the better quality publications, but still nonetheless taken seriously enough. In Great Britain, it's a common point of interest. Maggie Thatcher was the theologically most erudite prime minister since Gladstone. She would not only make several biblical and apostolic allusions, both in cabinet and parliament, much more pointedly, she would lecture the Kirk in Scotland about why it is that they shouldn't be opting for the poor, because their exegesis was all wrong. Now, whatever you may think of the Baroness, she was a formidable theological figure. She took theology seriously. She wasn't embarrassed by making comments in public, and she was not above or beyond reprimanding even the royal family when they got their theology wrong. But in Canada, the religious convictions of our ministers don't surface at all. I can remember several occasions being at conferences in Toronto where John Turner and Mark McGuigan would get up and fight about Thomistic principles and how they interpret them in their law careers and how this affected the Supreme Court judgment and how they were going to work with this in Parliament. And as soon as you left this conference, that was it. No reporter covered it. It was never seen as a matter of consequence. It was like a divertissement, like a hair coloring. You know, I mean, it's an interesting thing, but does it really matter? And yet the interesting point is that Justice Emmett Hall, who was a pivotal figure, of course, in the establishment of Medicare in this country, was shaped and formed by the social encyclicals and repeatedly talked about Rerum Novarum and what's the other one? Quadragesimo Anno in 1931 as pivotal in shaping his thinking. Not infrequently, Peter Wollstonecraft, who is the Associate Dean at the University of Waterloo in Special Programs, is a good friend of Joe Clark, and Peter constantly talks to me about Clark's strong religious convictions and how they define the way he sees his Rhetorianism. But in discussion about political figures, their religious convictions or their lack of religious convictions, it's never covered in the media. Only time it ever appears in the media is in relation to Preston Manning, and it's always pejorative. You know, they're kind of a parson's kid or a prairie preacher and a variation of the, well, not a variation of the social gospel movement, but part of that whole prairie Methodist tradition. And we just, you know, we kind of ice. That's interesting in Preston Manning's case, but somehow it doesn't apply in the rest. I can remember at one time spending several hours when working on a chapter of a book, several hours with Marc Lalonde. You will remember Marc Lalonde. He was Minister of Finance, he was Minister of Health. He was in many respects, not Jean Chrétien, but he was in many respects Trudeau's right-hand man. He was certainly the intellectual in the Trudeau cabinet. And Lalonde spoke unabashedly
about his shift from the particular kind of scholastic formation he had to the feminist principles of his wife in the Christian feminist movement, the Catholic feminist movement in Quebec, and how through his daughter and through his wife he could now begin to review some of the social Catholic principles that had been important in his career as a cabinet minister and a lawyer. And yet he would feel uncomfortable, made to feel uncomfortable in talking about this in a scrum, in a conference. No reporter would ever, no Canadian reporter would ever think to ask. It would be considered highly indecorous and inappropriate. And what as a consequence has happened is that the religious thought, I mean, look at Trudeau and his relationship with Charles Taylor. I mean, this is, I think, highly significant. Or the work of George Grant and the influence he has had on some politicians. We somehow seem to think that we better keep this out of the public forum. It would be slightly impolite, a little un-Canadian, better keep it private. And as a consequence, it never enters the arena. So our political figures and our political thinkers, and they're not necessarily the same, as you know, but when it does surface, religion is never a component in the discussion. And yet Trudeau, I mean, schooled on a number of Catholic intellectual movements in the immediate war years, that whole Blondel and Maurice Blondel movement, and he was attached to the school of personalism. Very interested in the writings of Jacques Maritain. In the late 1940s, he came under the influence of Father Lévesque, who was the great founder of the School of Social Sciences at Laval, who was instrumental in helping to shape Trudeau's mind. Trudeau himself, you know, put through the cauldron of a classical Jesuit formation. Okay? Now with a taste for Benedictine liturgy. Trudeau, I mean, to understand Trudeau and to leave out his religion seems to me to have one shell of a figure. And yet, with the possible exception of Richard Wynne, himself Jesuit trained at Stonyhurst, nobody seems to take it terribly seriously. There is much more interest in the fact that Bill Clinton spent 2 years in a Jesuit school in Washington, Georgetown, which was pivotal, by the way, to his getting a Rhodes, because the vice president at the time, Timothy Healy, a Jesuit and latterly the president of the New York Public Library System, was also a Rhodes Scholar and was worked behind the scenes to help with Clinton's nomination. We, you know, the Americans have made much of this. The Jesuits certainly made much of it. Now, recently, the Jesuits have distanced themselves from having been shapers of the Clinton sensibility. With classic Jesuitical panache, they've moved themselves quite a distance from the beleaguered president. But the fact still remains the American press found that interesting. We don't seem to find it interesting, at least in terms of our own political leadership. And so, for whatever reason, it seems to me we continue to privatize it. The Catholic New Times, yeah.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen that, you know, on the desk at Mass. I was coming out and I picked it up last night. But it's still within the realm of Catholics looking at themselves. It's not in the realm of general conscience about religion and faith and morality.
Now, there's no question that in looking for an organ or a publication of consequence that would take religion seriously in the public forum is a bit of a problem. Certainly, if you look at publications like the Canadian Forum, certainly occasionally something will appear. And in the alternative publications, this magazine, even Borderlines, you will get occasional pieces on religion. But you're quite right. There has been And certainly various intellectuals have attempted to try and find some way of producing a publication interdenominational across the boundaries that will provide a regular forum for the serious discussion of these issues that isn't going to be delimited by denominational commitment or support. And it's been a strenuous struggle, hasn't entirely succeeded. In the academy, there are efforts to do it, but again, the academy is a different world, and in its impact on the larger community, far less than we in the academy think we have. Yes, I think there's...
Hi, Dr. Higgins. I don't have your worldwide perspective, but I was brought up in Halifax here. I went to Roman Catholic schools, and I could throw a stone and hit a non-Roman Catholic school a little way down the block. I subsequently went and taught in those schools, and in that time, in a very short period of time, those schools became non-denominational. But I wouldn't go out in high school. I went to St. Patrick's High School, and I wouldn't go out with a girl. I just wouldn't particularly think of going out with a Protestant girl from Queen Elizabeth High School 35 years ago. That really wasn't done. But that's finished now. That's different now, and that happened in the last 20 years, perhaps. I wouldn't want to go back to that. Mm-hmm. I subsequently became, and I felt a large part of my education was when I became principal of a school that did not have a Roman Catholic background orientation. And I had to say the Protestant Our Father on a daily basis, or I would have been in trouble. And I was also brought up no, I wasn't brought up, but I was born in Antigonish, Nova Scotia. Its population is about 99% Roman Catholic. I think it's about somewhat the reverse in New Glasgow. And they had violent hockey matches that had, I don't know if they had any religion, anything to do with it at all. But I wouldn't want to go back to that. And I'm afraid a little bit afraid to speak as a Roman Catholic in this ecumenical world. I don't want to put the Roman Catholic point of view. I'm not quite sure what it is, but I tried to teach it for quite a while. But that's gone now. But to go, I think of going back to that when I have personal friends that told me 30 years ago, they would have crossed the street rather than walk by me on the street because I was a Roman Catholic. I went to a hockey game a year or two ago. My wife was a Roman Catholic. A guy walked by her and he said, "Hi, Diane." And he said, "You were the Catholic on our street." The only Catholic on the street, and that's all he remembered about her. So I'm afraid to go back to that. I don't know if that's different in Halifax. I know was unique in that the school board was public, all public, but there was this understanding that Westmount School was Protestant and St. Agnes School was Catholic. Mm-hmm. And boy, you didn't transfer in between them. Is there anything like that in Toronto? Or I mean, I'm afraid I wouldn't want to go back to that. I think it's finished, but I can't speak as a Roman Catholic and say, well, this is the way the Roman Catholics did it, because I think I'd be stoned.
Well, I think certainly any effort to recover a kind of tribalist approach in relation to other religions is undesirable. Certainly no one would want ever to reclaim that. And certainly in the Toronto scene, I think you have such a richness in simply by virtue of its huge size, over 2 million people now in the GTA, even larger than that, with a very rich, heterogeneous composition. I mean, you will have noticed over the years the shift from Toronto, not only in terms of demographics as a consequence of post-war immigration, but other changes as well that have really altered the religious, ethnic, and social makeup of the Toronto scene. Even so great a shift as to move the kind of strong hegemony that was once exercised by Methodists, more particularly by Anglicans, to other religious groups by virtue simply of their growing power and numbers. is a indication, I think, of the vitality of Toronto life, and it isn't necessarily accompanied by any kind of growth in what we used to call, anyway, triumphalism. I think that that has been, I hope, irreversibly shattered. There was a time, I remember, when Emmett Carter became the Cardinal Archbishop of Toronto, that there was a great degree of gloating, both in the Catholic press and in the secular press, and including Toronto Life, which covered it in great detail, about the fact that the power had shifted from the Anglican Church to the Church of Rome, but simply by virtue of more CEOs now being Catholics than they used to be, and that although old money was still Anglican money, Roman Catholic money was on the increase because of this and this and that. I found reading these articles quite uncomfortable, actually, because it suggested an ecclesiological model of operating which harkened back to a different era. It was like saying, well, that was your turn, now it's our turn. If you look at the situation now, several years later, you will find that this doesn't even enter into the debate. Nobody thinks in these terms. And the current Cardinal Archbishop is, if anything, more inclined to be isolationist than triumphalist in leading, and certainly wary of the press rather than courting the press. I don't know if this goes any way to answer your question. I would certainly suggest that the kind of tribalism, religious tribalism, that in great part was the result of our own historical evolution, is no longer the case in Toronto, as I suspect it is no longer the case in the Maritimes, that we won't lament its passing, and that we won't be eager generating its return. Yes?
Dr. Higgins, a comment rather than a question. I'm not a believer in single variable explanations as opposed to multivariate ones, but there's one variable which I think goes a long way towards contributing to the explanation to the difference between the interest in the United States versus the non-interest in Canada. We mustn't forget the relative demographics of the two countries. In the United States, Roman Catholics are approximately 25% of the population, and to a very large degree do see themselves as an embattled minority, whether for historical or economic or other reasons. Mm-hmm. Whereas in Canada, the population of Roman Catholics compared to Protestants is approximately 45% to approximately 50%, with 5% remainder. So and for historical reasons of accommodations to Quebec and other reasons, to a larger degree than in the United States, the Catholics, instead of being an exotic and embattled minority, were actually, to a larger degree, bought into the whole process and had a larger investment in it, and were to some degree, simply by virtue of numbers, somewhat less exotic and easier to find, I submit. That obviously does not explain the differences, say, between Canada and the UK or between other countries, but given two large English-speaking countries side by side, I think that is one explanation that goes a long way towards explaining the differences in attitudes of the media in the two countries.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's right. Thank you. Good. Yes?
Excuse, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I am curious. Your series of lectures has covered radio, television, press. I'm wondering if you have any observations on the fastest growing form of media, the internet. I'm an alumnus of the university. It's quite frankly very fascinated with what's going on with technological development, and if you've called up the number of websites or chat pages that deal religion either in the mainstream or at the periphery, I mean, they're growing by leaps and bounds.
Yes, they are.
Mm-hmm. And I was wondering if you had any observations on that.
No. But you have certainly put me on the spot, and rightly so. Yes, there's no question that the internet is a major source now, and largely untapped, or at least unexamined.
Well, it eliminates the national and international boundaries of the language barrier.
Absolutely.
Anything that gets on there, if it's not in English, you can get it in English.
That's right. That's right. That's a whole new seat and lecture series. But you're quite right, and it's good to be reminded by it. No, I haven't. No, but it's quite appropriate. I've limited myself very clearly to the traditional media, but you're bang on, and certainly. The University of Waterloo, being the university that it is something that in our face every day, something that I'm aware of. But like most new technologies, something that we need some distance from in order to not objectify it, but in order to approach it in a disinterested way. I'm not sure that we're at that point yet to approach it in a disinterested way. I think we're still caught in the passion of the moment, and 10 years from now. It'll take me that long to absorb it. Any other questions or comments? Thank you very much for sitting through these lectures for the last time.
It is now my privilege, duty, to thank our speaker, Dr. Higgins, whose wisdom is matched only by his breadth of experience and information. Michael, you have shown yourself to be not only sensitive to the issues relating to religion and the media, but you are also articulate, courageous, and forceful in bringing together culture, spirituality, and a global ethos. You have a great gift of clarity without undue simplification, of balance without undue wishy-washiness, of breadth without undue vagueness, of practicality without undue compromise. We'll switch off the tape. And you may be our new Peter Ustinov. And I would like to thank the audience whose attention, participation will help us or help you to bring fruits to Canada, to improve whatever the media are bringing about religion, especially internet and the web, which are certainly communication of the future and an immediate future for a long time to come. And I would like to invite all of you for some refreshment in the faculty lounge in Seaton 404-405 and to meet Dr. Higgins to carry on our conversation. And I now declare the 21st lecture series closed. Thank you. Indeed, indeed.
Is that bad? Oh, okay. It's just for a couple of times. Just a couple of times. For once, because you see, if you're looking, contrast. Well, you see, if you're looking at a small passage of print, right? Right. And you're here like this.
Now I'll give you a hint. You'll bring something. Put it on the Xerox machine.
Okay, we'll go ahead and I'll see you later.
At some point, but you should have done it.
Yeah, but then you would have known the lecture and you wouldn't have shown up. Hi, Tom. Right.